a lot of different roles. It's a weird thing. And basically, so the question was like, of the four, like, how would you rank them? Like, what were their main strengths and weaknesses now that we have such a body of work on the four? Now, I think who's first and last is very clear. Nothing drives me crazy. Plenty of things drive me crazy with Jet fans, and I'm a Jet fan too. I say plenty of things that drive myself and other people crazy, but saying that Douglas is like their best GM in franchise history, saying that Douglas is their best GM in the past 20 years, he's not remotely close to as good of a GM as Mike Tannenbaum. It's not even close. It's not even discussion. Tannenbaum finished with a record over 500. Tannenbaum got the team to the AFC Championship game twice, to the playoffs 3 times. We're regularly at or above 500. The records speak for himself. Douglas, outside of Kotite, has the worst GM record in Jets franchise history. I think Tannenbaum, outside of Parcells, is the best. So for all his flaws, and people remember the end with Tebow and the Sanchez apology contract and the Plaxico and the Derek Mason for Jericho Cotchery, I hear you. I get it. Doesn't matter. He drafted David Harris, Darrelle Revis, Nick Mangold, DeBrickashaw Ferguson, Brad Smith, Leon Washington. I could go on and on and on and on. And got the Jets almost to the Super Bowl twice and kept them relevant. And the trades. Traded for Braylon Edwards. Yeah.
Trades. Cromartie, Braylon, and Santonio were killer trades.
What are your best moments of the Jets from the past 20 years? They're all guys that Mike Tannenbaum acquired.
Bingo.
Outside of, like, obviously the Pennington and Martin stuff, but the rest of it is all guys that Tannenbaum acquired. So he's number one. It's not even close right now. The last that has to be Idzik. Was only 2 years, was their 5th choice. They got him because they refused to fire Rex Ryan, the start of really the drought and the half measures. They should have fired Rex and Tannenbaum together. That's what really kicked off this problematic situation. Ironically, Idzik, I think, still has a better winning percentage at this point than Douglas, but that's not fair because he only had 2 years. The Jets did go 8-8 with him and then dropped to 4-12. It was the Plains and the Billboards, and he just couldn't handle the media. He clearly was not the guy for the job. And good for them for actually just like pulling the plug too early. And then, McCagnon and Douglas are basically like, it sucks how close they actually are because no one was more critical than Mike Maccagnan than me and then you and us through this venue. Like, we killed Maccagnan the last few years of his tenure. From the second he drafted Darren Lee and Christian Hackenberg, his tenure was an unmitigated disaster.
Yep.
And the numbers bore it out, right? He went 10-6 his first year, won executive of the year, and he totally fell off a cliff after that. Still has a slightly better winning percentage than Joe Douglas, but
that's insane.
But got 4.5 seasons, really. Got to do the draft in the offseason. Was known as like the coffee and the numbers, and was picked by Charlie Casserly, but had sort of, like, we've talked about this a little bit, like the right thought and approach at times, just couldn't pick the right players. And there's so many disgusting moments draft-wise and roster building-wise there. I'll still give Douglas a slight edge and say he's second. And it should be a bigger gap, but Douglas's record speaks for itself. And if you take away that Maccagnan-Gase year, the winning percentage is like even uglier. For Douglas's credit, he's found a couple stars here, like true stars. I know you could say, look, Maccagnan got Quinn and Williams. He got CJ Mosley here, even though he overpaid him. But Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, Breece Hall, and to a lesser extent, Jermaine Johnson, that has saved everything else, which has been a complete mess. I mean, those 4 guys have given Douglas this much rope. Now, he's gotten Aaron Rodgers here. We have to see how this ultimately plays out. Now, it hasn't worked to date. Can't, the turf, it is what it is. There was certainly risk in getting Rodgers. This is the risk you have to take when you totally miss in the second pick in the draft and you miss on the left tackle to protect him. But it's depressing how close, because Maccagnan was so bad, man. And it's depressing that they're even remotely close. So that's my rant of the 4. And to be clear, Parcells was the best GM they ever had. So he was 1, Tannenbaum's 2. And then it's like the guy from the 80s, like I think it's like Jim Kensel or something, who built all those teams. And everyone else kind of like stunk. I don't remember if Weeb Eubank was technically the GM or not. Obviously, he'd be up there too. But that's really it when it comes to winners for the Jets.
Right. To rank the 4, you were all over it. I think it's very clear and concise. Very clear. I mean, it's Tannenbaum, then a big gap, then Douglas, and then a gap, Maccagnan, but not a big gap, but Maccagnan, and then a big gap in Idzik. Idzik is arguably one of the worst GMs of the modern era. When you look back at, I mean, the lack of strategy, the lack of philosophy, he couldn't evaluate. Everybody that was around him knew he couldn't evaluate. He was supposed to be a cap guy, and he knew how to. What you have to say about Idzik is you kind of sit there and wonder, was he? I don't think this, but it just makes you wonder. Was he, for that time of the Jets organization when they weren't? Remember, they didn't spend any money. Yeah, everybody was like, it was a joke on Twitter. Hashtag Idzik's plan. He wouldn't spend any money, and everybody's like, the Jets are. That's when people started to fall in love with cap space. And people were like, he's loading up and the Jets are going to be like a lethal problem because he's sitting in the shadows and they're not doing anything. And now that I look back at that, like, was that just an excuse for Woody Johnson not spending any money?
I think so, yeah.
Right, probably. And Idzik was terrible. But I think where you look at it, or what they were good at, right? I just said it with Idzik. He was bad at pretty much everything with being a GM. And I talked to Idzik one time at Jets camp. This is when I didn't think about how young I was back then. I don't even know if I might have just graduated college, maybe. And like really nice, personable guy. You could just walk right up to him. I had a field pass, so like I just walked up and introduced myself, and he was totally normal. You always feel bad when you're like, damn, like this guy's getting killed and he's terrible at this, but like they're good people. It's just that, and he was not good at pressers, so that's why I was so surprised. I was like, this guy is awful when he's in front of the media, but one-on-one he was fine. He was just bad at every aspect of the job. Maccagnan was good at, or what he enjoyed was the day 3 and UDFA process. Like those are things that, because that's what he got to do with the Texans. He liked that. He actually, to his credit, when he got here, the Brandon Marshall trade is one of the best trades in modern Jets history. Yep. That was a great move. I think, honestly, we joke about this, but signing Josh McCown was a great move. McCown has one of the better Jets quarterback seasons of the last 15 years. It's true. And the process with McCown was the Jets, right in 15, there was the competitive rebuild. It worked to an extent and then didn't. Then they brought in McCown just to have a leader for who they were going to draft. And they tanked with McCown. And then they wanted him there when they were going to draft Sam. And obviously all the roster building after that. Like drafting and free agency, he was abysmal at. With Douglas is a weird one because he's so spotty. He has 10 out of 10 moves, but it feels like 1 out of every 7 to 8 moves is a 10 out of 10 move. And then the other 7 are like barely a 2 out of 10, right? Yeah. I mean, free agency, we think of the good, right? DJ Reed, good move. Then you look at the little ones like Quentin Jefferson was a nice signing. There's stuff like that. But God, they've had some awful whiffs. Almost every O-line move he makes goes to hell. Yep. Their draft is so hot and cold. First draft, horrible. The draft with Zach, now you look back at it. I mean, if AVT is not an all-pro, that draft's a nightmare. Michael Carter and AVT saved that draft. But when you think of the resources in comparison they had for that draft, they blew it at number 2. They blew the Elijah Moore pick. I mean, Michael Carter, it's a 4th-round running back, whatever. But then you look at Garrett and Sauce, and Brees and Jermaine, home run, home run, home run, home run. And then it feels like this year, it's like they probably got a player in Joe Tippin, but we don't know after that. We just don't know. So he runs so hot and cold. But I think my problem with Douglas is not even personnel evaluations. Like they hit on players. It's the big picture, putting it all together. He has not hired the right coaching staff. He's not built around young quarterbacks. He's not. Actually, let me rephrase all that. My biggest problem with Douglas is that I think he's one of the least creative GMs they've ever had. I really do. There's never a trade where we're like, damn, that was a good move by the Jets. Like we didn't see that.
Didn't see that coming. Yeah.
Didn't see that coming. And I know some people are like, well, they went up and got Jermaine in the draft. Okay, yes. But I'm talking about like going out on the pro market and getting a player. We just talked about all those moves Tannenbaum made. We talked about Maccagnan doing it once. They just haven't hit on those. Yeah. And then the thing that he's probably the worst at, because I think I've given him some fair love here. Like there's some really good evaluations. The thing that he's the worst at is that they have no idea what they're doing with with salary cap. It's when you just look at these contracts, you're like, what? How did we even get here? Like, how are we Bobby Bonilla-ing CJ Uzama and Laken Tomlinson and Carl Lawson? And how are we doing this? Where did we like a guy at home on over the cap can almost do a better job than this. So that's why, and I think people it doesn't resonate with everybody when I say things like that, because that bill hasn't come yet, right? It's like when you're at the bar and you're like, oh, I'm having the time of my life. Like, I haven't looked at the tab. And then you go to close out at 2 a.m. and you're like, what did I do? Like, that might be the Jets a year from now, honestly.
Those are going to be fun podcasts to talk
about.
Like,
I don't want to be doing that.
You're right, though. I mean, some of the stuff, if you look at some of the numbers around, like, Uzama and Lakin.
It's horrific. It's what
Carl Lawson.
It goes back to, wow, they might not pay Bryce Huff.
Yeah,
really?
But you got money for all this other stuff. But we can't. Bryce Huff. We finally found an edge rusher since John Abraham, undrafted free agent, one of the best moves of the Douglas era, and we're gonna go let him go sign somewhere else to get 14 sacks a year. Doesn't make sense.
They paid Carl Lawson and Dalvin Cook what, $17 million this year for. Let's look it up. For a
Al Lazard.
Oh, that's. Well, I will blame Rodgers for that. Like, I will. Yeah. But, man, for no sacks from Carl Lawson and
no touchdowns from Cook, less than 200 yards.
Less than 200 yards.
Yeah. It's just absolutely depressing. All right, so there's our GM ranking. If you haven't yet, subscribe to War Room. We did a whole other half hour on some more draft stuff. We are going to have a packed feed this week, as always. Connor will be on draft season, which should hit Thursday-ish. Buck to Trend Friday. Should have something new dropping over the weekend, and feed's busy, as always. Also looks like, as we're recording this, Bucks are up 13-0. Todd Bowles could be marching into the second round if he doesn't blow it in the second half. We'll see. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will talk to you soon.